and thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With us today, we have Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you this morning.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well, and we're lucky today.
Yes.
We have somebody that's going to give us a lecture on good foreign policy. So we're delighted to have Jim Jatras here today, friend of ours. We even knew him back when we were doing duty in Washington, D.C.
That's right.
So, Jim, it's great to have you here. And you've helped us out a lot on a real pet project of Daniel's, talking to young people when we have our annual conference. And you didn't come once or twice. You've come a good many times. And you do a great job. And you have a good reputation. You've come out with a book on a summary. Now, I kid about myself, but I'm serious. Some people write books, and some people do what I do. We just jot down things and pretend to give speeches. But he has a book out, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. But it's about your history, Jim. And I just want to introduce you to the audience and just say welcome to our program. It's great to see you today.
Well, Dr. Paul, it's an honor to be down here with you and Daniel. I mean, as you pointed out, we've known each other for a long time. When I was working at the Republican leadership in the Senate, you were still in Congress, and among the few friendly ears anywhere around the place on things like war and peace, especially all the nonsense that was going on in the Balkans and the Middle East. I mean, you could count on one hand who people were that you could rely on. You didn't even need your thumb. So it's a pleasure to be with you. And also talking to the young people at the Ron Paul Institute,
Yes.
at the conference. I mean, we just saw each other a week ago up at Dulles Airport. And I know every time I talk to the young people, I sort of wonder, am I going to get a cup of hemlock for corrupting the youth? But I think it's very encouraging to see the kind of young people you attract to this movement, to the Liberty platform, and some of them have gone on to do great things where they're actually making a difference in the world. And I think it's a tribute to you, Dr. Paul.
One thing that I noticed that I learned, having been in Washington, more so when I got involved in some of the national campaigns, you go into the college campuses, and you've had a lot of experience, more than a couple years, several years. We won't tell them how long you've really been doing this. But I changed my attitude because when I first started thinking about this, I was pretty average conservative, and welfare was just those bad people who needed food stamps. And I never thought, well, maybe they need food stamps because of some stupid government policy. It is something that that crossed my mind a short time after I went to Washington, that the young people sometimes get a bad rap. Yeah, there's a lot of clowns out there, and there will always be. But I've been impressed, and you've did this over the years. Do you think you've seen any changes? Do you think you have a little bit more optimism about what the young people are reading and the access to some of our liberty philosophy than it was when you first started this?
Yes, definitely. I mean, look, just as in my own life, I've seen evolution from when I was just a standard conservative, anti-communist, and all that. And you saw what happened after the end of the Cold War and the way basically these neoconservatives want to turn us into the new ideological Soviet Union. I think a lot of these young people are less likely to be, well, frankly, they're less trusting and less naive of what they're being told by their betters they have to believe and do. They're skeptical, they're inquiring. That's a good thing. Ask questions, question more. And I think that's something they're doing.
Yes, Daniel.
Yeah, well, the program that Dr. Paul is talking about is our Ron Paul Scholar Seminar, and we always do that the day before. And actually, we have a dinner the night before. Before that, this is before our annual conference. And one of the great things, I think you've spoken to all four of them, haven't you? Maybe just the last three.
No. All four of them. I was there with the first one.
Yeah.
I've addressed them, all three of them, and then this time we did the lunchtime discussion with John Sharp and Phil Giraldi.
Yeah. But one of the things about it on Thursday nights, because I'm usually, my head is full of all the things we have to do, so you usually kind of take over the dinner because you're interacting and talking with them. What kinds of impressions have you gotten over the years of these young people?
They're a really mixed crowd in terms of their backgrounds, where they come from. But I think, as we were saying earlier, there's that spirit of inquiry, of questioning, that I think is really going to serve them well, especially as we move into very, very uncertain times in this country and in the world.
Yeah.
Well, politically, there's always a subject. We don't see our program as being a political program, but it sort of drifted into, coming up and commenting on major issues, and a lot of them are political. And right now, there's a political event. I think it's tomorrow or something. No, maybe it's tonight. Yeah, something's coming up. I think some people are coming together and they're going to have this argument.
Yeah.
But all the rules are, don't say a nasty word to anybody.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm talking about the debates, the presidential debates, and I imagine you've given that a little bit of thought. What do you think's good? What can you think of? Very many good things that'll come from the debate, or how do you assess this debate?
Well, Americans like to be infotained by these things, and
that's a good word.
I think when people watch it, they're not really listening so much about where do you stand on the issues, what are you going to do if you're president, but rather it's more like, has somebody made a gaffe? Did they offend some group or something of the sort? Did he look bad? Did she look bad? Was he disrespectful to her? All this kind of thing. And then, of course, the media will then spin it any way they want, say, oh, he said something dumb, she lied, or whatever it might be. And, it's basically almost like a sports event for a lot of people.
I mean, as I see it, this is going to be a very different debate than when Trump debated Hillary. That was very different. Now, that was very entertaining. That was Trump letting loose. That was Trump winning over a lot of people who didn't like Hillary. I mean, people don't like her. She's not likable. And he was able to build on that. Now, I think this is going to have to be a different debate. So what would you do if Kamala called Jim and she said, Jim, you've been around D.C. a lot. You were in the legislative branch. You were in the executive branch. You were a lobbyist. What can I do? What can I do against this guy, this orange beast? Give me some advice. What would you tell her?
I would try to find some way to provoke him to say something disrespectfful that had sexual or racial implications. Because that is going to offend some group of voters that she's going to want to need. Then again, look, I have to confess to you, I'm a little skeptical about the integrity of our elections anyway. So I'm not entirely sure that it's necessarily about winning votes, but rather positioning a narrative for however things are going to be managed when the election day comes.
The most recent foreign policy event of major proportions that we've dealt with and you've talked about, and that has to do with Ukraine. And we've been talking about it since 2014. Every once in a while people say, how did you start talking about that? Well, I had a good advisor. I read your stuff. Daniel McAdams kept me up to date. And it is very revealing, and we look at this that NATO had something to do with it, starting this thing. But eternally, even today, we see constantly. I think even yesterday, when Russia invaded Ukraine and started this war, and they never look at it objectively. And have you sensed that? I'm sure you've sensed this is happening, but is that something that you address, or you try to ignore because it's so crazy?
Well, of course, the standard phrase is Russia's full-scale unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, and of course, it was neither full-scale nor unprovoked. I mean, they. For reasons that we know only too well, whether we're talking about the Balkan Wars, the expansion of NATO, or the militarization of Ukraine, the shelling of the Donbass, that Russia tried in many, many ways to engage with us to find a peaceful solution to this, and we basically told them to get lost, and they finally reluctantly did something. Look, and you could argue that maybe they should have done something else or not done this at all, but this is a regional power, maybe still a world power, right on its own doorstep. Look at our interventions in other countries. Iraq is a direct national interest of the United States. Libya. I mean, these are countries halfway across the world that are not vital to our national security in the way that Ukraine is to Russia's, and still. We have an establishment in Washington that's willing to kill basically every young man in Ukraine, and maybe starting on the women too, and risk a real war between NATO and Russia that could, be the end of all of us. And they don't seem to care, and most Americans don't seem to care.
Right. And there's another issue going on right now, foreign policy, which is dangerous. That is, of course, the Middle East. Yeah. That's been around for a long time. And I don't think there's any way we can list them, say this one is a lot worse than the other one. But just talk about the two together For me, and well, how we think about this is all part of one philosophy that we're engaged in doing things we shouldn't have, and it shouldn't surprise us. But so both are dangerous. But is there any way that you sort of lean towards saying, yes, they're both very dangerous, but I worry more about A rather than B?
I think for the shorter term, the possibility of a wider conflagration is greater in the Middle East than is Ukraine. But I think Ukraine is still a bigger point of combustion.
Right.
That the prospects of an early expansion of the conflict are greater in the Middle East. And of course, you could put China, Taiwan further back on the menu for something in the future. But in a way, there's a very strong parallel between Zelensky in Ukraine and Netanyahu in Israel. Each of them want to drag us into a war. Zelensky wants to drag us into a direct war between NATO and Russia. Netanyahu wants to drag us into a direct war between the United States and Iran. And of course, for better or worse, probably worse, Netanyahu has a lot more influence in Washington than Zelensky does. Zelensky's star is kind of faded, whereas let's face it, I mean, most of your former colleagues up there, Netanyahu has more influence in Washington than Joe Biden does, or whoever is standing behind working his mouthparts.
One other group that's wants to drag us into war, American citizens that work for the military-industrial complex.
Yeah,
that's a big one.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, let's face it. Eisenhower's military-industrial complex was a horse and buggy compared to the Formula One racer that is the deep state today. Because not just the traditional things, the intelligence, the military, the arms manufacturers, it's the financial system, it's Hollywood, it's IT, it's the big pharma. You go down the list, there's this huge nomenclature of power that are all pointing in that direction.
Right. Daniel?
The one thing that's interesting is, though, when you look at time, because I tend to agree with you that the Middle East is possibly a more dangerous situation. But when you factor in the fact that we are only a few weeks from an election that could go either way, as you say, there's some questions about the veracity of our system, let's just say.
No, we're the envy of the world when it comes to the honesty of our elections, because we have machines.
That's right, we have good machines. But the fact of the matter is, the people who have done so well on Project Ukraine, $200 billion, none of it went to Ukraine. It all went to the Beltway bandits. You know how it works. You know how that system works very well, too, the system of getting that money. But they're looking now at the potential end of that gravy train. Trump has said, bombastically, as usual, I will end it in 24 hours. I don't think that's going to happen. We talked last night when we had dinner together about the Flights Kellogg plan. I don't think that's going to end it in 24 hours.
No.
But nevertheless, you have this sense that the end game is coming. The gravy train may run out. And so that may be why you're seeing things like the Kursk incursion, all of these sort of seemingly fake PR things.
Well, as I say, Zelensky needs to find a way to escalate and get us directly into the conflict more than we are now. As far as Trump, look, even if he does win, I hope he learned something for the first time around. But remember, the militarization of Ukraine mostly took place under Trump, not under Obama.
Obama wouldn't do it.
No. And just like, for example, how many times? 3 times did he order U.S. troops out of Syria, and that didn't happen?
Yeah.
I'm not convinced that whatever Trump's druthers are, or even Vance's, that they will really be able to turn that ship around and keep the machine from just operating the way it has been over the last few years.
I almost get the sense that all someone would have to say to Trump is, well, this is making you look weak and making America look weak.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and he'll turn it around.
He's unpatriotic.
And that seems to have been his approach too. I'll just bluster and threaten people, and they'll all fall into line. Well, what if they don't?
Yeah.
I have an article here in Politico. I'd like you to make a comment on it. The title is Opinion. The forever wars were a mistake. Supporting Ukraine is not. And they were referencing J.D. Vance. And he has gone in different positions, but he's under the attack now because he looks like he might be drifting in our direction, And I think that is bigger than I'm hoping it's bigger than we've imagined, but we've encouraged it. And that is that maybe there is still a coalition out there. Maybe we can split the Republican Party from the warmongering positions. So I imagine you got a peek at that.
Well, I think there is a reservoir of opinion out there that wants to move in a more realistic direction on these things. Look, I remember even in 2016 when Trump denounced the Iraq War in front of a primary crowd in South Carolina, very military state. People loved it. You know, I mean, you wouldn't expect that to work, but it did work. You know, and so I think that. I hope Vance is sincere about this. I hope Trump is sincere about moving this direction. Whether they can actually do it or not is a whole other story. And as far as this article goes, it's amazing to me how you can peddle this sort of thing. Oh, those other wars in the back, those were mistakes. But this one, they're telling the truth this time, you know? And of course, what are we going to wait for? When this war is in the back, rearview mirror, we'll say, yeah, Ukraine was a mistake, but the current war, that's one we really got to win.
Trust us this time.
Trust us this time.
But, you know, this is written by Matt Gallagher, who was in the Iraq War. And it does smack a little bit of desperation because he's saying, hey, you know, I went in there, I hook, line, and sinker, I bought the whole thing. I went in there looking for the weapons of mass destruction. We were duped. We were lied to. But by golly, J.D. Vance, you're wrong. This is the good war. We finally found a good war. It reminds me of when Obama was elected. The Iraq war is a bad war. Afghanistan is a good war. And it's almost out of desperation. But here's a little quote from this article, Dr. Paul, that I know if our good friend Jimmy Duncan was sitting here, he'd be perfect. And our good friend Walter Jones, who sadly is no longer with us. So here's what Matt Gallagher, who was duped into fighting the Iraq war and is now trying to pull something out. He says, Vance has emerged as the face of a new movement in the GOP, led by veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I love this part. That stands against more traditional conservative support for aggressive foreign policy interventions. Is that really the traditional conservative position? Has he ever heard of Taft?
When you think we're winning and we can let up a little bit, we better read that. We still have a job.
Yeah, I think aggressive foreign policy. Wasn't that in George Washington's farewell speech?
I think
so.
I've always had trouble separating foreign policy and economic policy because they mesh. And of course, the founders and many others throughout our history had said that you know the principle is that if you don't trade with people and get along with people, you're more likely to fight with people. And right now, Trump is pretty clear on many of his beliefs, and as you say, he said something about foreign policy. We hope he sticks to it, but he says something that I think he's going to stick to it, and I'm not happy about it because I like free trade and free travel because I do believe that people should mingle and they're less likely to fight with each other. But there was an article this morning that Trump's demanding anybody messes with us, we're going to put 100% tariffs on that. That doesn't make any sense at all, and that can override some of these other positions. You know, this is a big issue.
Yeah, and of course, you know, Washington is addicted to sanctions. They love to slap sanctions on people, and they seem to be unwilling to face the fact that they don't always work, and they're becoming less and less effective because we don't have the same throw weight in the international system as we used to have when it comes to finance. We're basically cutting out the legs from what had been our supremacy in the past. That's going to come back to haunt us here, when, you know, especially when the dollar is not the coin of the world.
It's an incentive for the coalition against us.
Exactly right.
The guys against us.
Yeah. And of course, the big fear I have back to the Middle East is that Trump, for whatever reason, has decided he's going to become more Catholic than the Pope when it comes to being pro-Israel in the Middle East and doubling down on support for Israel and threatening Iran. Now, he backed away from attacking Iran a couple times when he was in office the first time. Will he deliver this time as the neocons want? That's a big question mark.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing about the sanctions, though, and I just saw this on Twitter X earlier today. So, you know, the whole big thing now is the Biden administration. I mean, you can't even say Biden administration. The blank administration is now, their big thing is Iran is providing missiles to Russia. We're the only ones that are allowed to provide weapons to other countries.
How dare
this
they?
Isn't right. And so
they?
Blinken made the big announcement. We are announcing a couple of new sanctions on Iran.
Oh, well.
It's like, that'll do it.
Yeah, that'll show up.
Yeah. Everything is a nail when all you have is a hammer, it seems like. But I was going to ask you one thing, and forgive me because we haven't discussed this before, but do you have any sense, because it's all speculation now, any sense of how Trump's foreign policy team might be taking shape? Is there any names that you've been looking at that may give us some encouragement or discouragement?
Do I have any sense? That's a good question.
Or dollars.
Well, you mentioned flights and Kellogg. They were the ones who wrote that ridiculous peace plan a few weeks ago.
It's the dumbest thing I've ever read.
And as I understand it, and I could be wrong, as I understand it, when Viktor Orban went to see Trump in Mar-a-Lago, they were somehow in that orbit. I don't know if he met with him personally, but apparently they do have Trump's ear. I don't know if Mike Pompeo is still around in that orbit. General Flynn is, but I don't know. I think that's actually more positive influence as far as I can tell.
Except for China.
Except for China. So I don't know. I mean, I don't want to presume anything, but the indications I've gotten is that he really hasn't learned the lesson from his first time around in office in terms of his personnel selection. I hope he does somewhat better, but I'm not convinced of it.
Yeah.
I got my draft notice in 1962. There were a few missiles down in Cuba, and there was a war going on in Vietnam, and but it still persists. I think my attitude, I know, has changed definitely about Russia, because it was that the missiles in Cuba, so you shouldn't be able to just totally ignore that. But they're keeping this ball rolling because we're supposed to still fear Russia, and they almost paint it like it's still the Soviet Union, and they have to do this. And some of their policies that the neocons push is the basic goal is somehow or another we have to weaken Russia, sanctions, and start a war with them. So will they be successful doing this, or are they going to strengthen Russia eventually?
Well, they keep strengthening Russia, but first off, 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. We're in a much more dangerous situation today because the orders for when to launch, or launch on warning and so forth, are far more hair trigger now than they were in 1962. So that's one problem. The other thing, I think there are some people, especially some older conservatives, who still think, Russia is still the Soviet Union. That's not the major problem. When I was at the State Department, I served on the Soviet desk. My dad was the Air Force attaché in Moscow. And back then, there was a lot of not necessarily pro-Soviet, but not anti-Soviet opinion, because after all, they're godless, they're secular, they're progressive, they're kind of like us, And then when that ended, all the people I used to work there with, when they were not particularly anti-Soviet, became very anti-Russian. Because now it's a national state, it's got to kind of have a Christian ethos to it. That's really, really bad. We don't want that sort of thing. So there's actually, think about it. Was Khrushchev, Brezhnev, even Stalin ever demonized the way Vladimir Putin is? No, you don't say that. It's this hostility to Russia is something that's not just a continuation of the Cold War legacy of the Soviet Union. It's something new and qualitatively different, I think.
It's convenient to motivate people to spend more money here in this country fighting the potential war that's just down the road.
Yeah. And it also dovetails with some of the domestic pathologies having to do with, sexual and racial and ethnic issues that somehow, the Russians are bad people because they're the kind of people like those deplorables that we've got to get rid of in this country. Putin is the leader of this right-wing conservative movement around the world, and we've got to kill that because those are bad people in the United States too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, let's segue and talk a little bit about your book, because your book just came out. I'm going to hold up a cover of it, try to get it without gleaming. But before we talk a little bit about the book, I have to share the back cover picture. If we can zoom in on that at all. I know it's a little bit tricky to see.
There we go.
But who's that?
That is a fascinating picture. It caught my attention immediately. You have Pat Buchanan on the right, Ron Paul on the left, and Jim Jatras in the middle. Tell us a little bit about that picture.
Who's a handsome fellow with a short, dark beard? I don't know. Yeah, that was a Christmas party at Pat Buchanan's house in 1996.
Wow.
And it was great. I mean, all the best people were there. What can I say?
Well, tell us about the book a little bit now.
Well, by the way, the cigarette I'm smoking there, that was in 1962, the same year. I was 7 years old. It was a hotel room in Paris. And I didn't smoke another one until 2023. So I'm going to pace myself and not smoke another one until 2084. So, it's a collection of my writings over the last 5 decades. We were talking about this before the show. you need to do the same. Collect your writings because it would be 10 times. You'll need 10 volumes like that, Because I guess as I'm getting older, I just didn't like the idea that anything I've written will just sort of disappear along with me when the time comes. So I kind of figure, well, there's something kind of a legacy thing, an epitaph, if you will, and so it basically. It's just I've written on any number of topics from domestic politics, international relations, a lot of that, religion, many other things. I just wanted to have a kind of a compendium of it.
Well, for me, I mean, it's kind of personal because a lot of this harkens back to that late 90s era where I started reading Justin Raimondo. I discovered antiwar.com. I discovered Jim Jatras. I discovered your mother, Stella Jatras, who was a firebrand.
Gosh.
And I discovered Ron Paul and Lou Rockwell. So you start reading these five people, and you suddenly get a real sense of foreign policy and non-interventionism, and it makes sense. It becomes kind of a unified theory, not rather than, so this war is not good, that war is okay. You just start understanding the whole concept of it. So a lot of these early essays, I can't wait to read it. I just got it when we were at the conference, but a lot of those early essays were really formative when I really started thinking seriously about foreign policy.
Yeah, and it really does reflect an evolution in my thinking, because I was a very conventional conservative anti-communist then. But I think as people get, if you will, red-pilled about what's really going on in this country and the world, it does tend to assume a kind of a unified coherence that we underestimate.
When you were, Mark, making comments about individuals that you knew, that means ideas do have consequences.
They do, exactly. They change lives.
And they're they don't realize that it's more powerful than those guns.
Yeah, that's right.
So, well, I think it's about time. This has been great that you've been here. You came all the way to Lake Jackson. I know you were in Texas, but you made the effort to come see us. So that is really great.
Well, people say, have you seen beautiful downtown Clute? And I said, I just haven't, so I just got to see it.
Yeah, there's a lot of jokes about Clute. Their celebration each year is a mosquito
Festival, yeah.
festival.
I think
I don't know whether they still have that, but
they do, yeah.
The mosquito festival.
Do they round them up and brand them, or what?
So I just want to thank you, Jim, for coming out. We spent some time together chatting, and thanks for all your participation in the work we do at RPI, and thanks for coming to the studio.
Hey, Jim, do you have an address to tell our audience that they're looking to find out what you're going to do next week?
Twitter?
The only place is Twitter is at Jim Jatras. That's my only online presence.
That's easy.
And I'm very reachable. As we say in Spanish, I am disposable. So if you want to, I'm happy to go on other people's programs. And and what can I say? And buy the book.
Yeah, buy the book.
Steal this book.
That's it. I want to thank our audience today for tuning in today. This has been an excellent program as far as I'm concerned. I thank Jim very much for taking the time to come over. And if you're ready to read and get a summary of what Jim's been thinking about, he tells me 50 years, but I don't know. I think you're fibbing a little bit on that. 50 years?
Well, the earliest essay there's
1985. When you were about 8 years old when you started or something? Anyway, thank you very much. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in today. Please come back soon to the Liberty Report.